This is Curious Minnesota, a Star Tribune project that sends staff from the state's largest newsroom hunting for the answers to great questions we receive from you, our readers. We're here to answer everything you want to know about the state's people, places, and culture.
Welcome to Curious Minnesota. I'm your host, Eric Roper. On today's show, we are talking about Prince, who, it goes without saying, is among the most famous celebrities ever to hail from Minnesota. Prince grew up in Minneapolis, but as he developed into a pop sensation, he chose to make his home in the western suburb of Chanhassen. But why Chanhassen? That's what a reader asked Curious Minnesota, and that's what we'll be discussing today with Star Tribune music critic Jon Bream, who has been covering Prince since the 1970s. Here's my conversation with Jon. Well, Jon, thanks so much for joining us today. So, all right, we're going to be talking about Prince. First, I want to set the scene about you. You began covering Prince, is it in 77? Is that right?
Yeah, that was the first time I actually encountered him in his professional career.
Okay.
I went out to the studio he was recording in Sausalito, the record plant, and he was recording his first album all by himself, and I went there. And not only he wouldn't talk to me, he wouldn't do anything while I was in the studio. He just sat there behind the drum and hitting the cymbal one note at a time until I left.
Okay, but you got to know him better over the years in covering
I
it.
knew him for, I think, 6 years before he looked me in the eye.
Okay. So you spent a lot of time building up this relationship with Prince.
It's a long relationship from 1977 until today. Still covering him.
Okay. So, all right, to tell this tale about Prince in Chanhassen, we have to start in Minneapolis just to kind of like get Prince's life story established. So Prince is born in Minneapolis. Whereabouts is he kind of hanging out in Minneapolis? What is he doing?
In his childhood, he kind of shuttled between the north side and the south side. Mm-hmm. He eventually graduated from Minneapolis Central High School.
Okay.
And then pretty much it was on to his professional career. He graduated in 76. He signed his record deal in 77.
And meets you around the same time, right? So This is formative Prince years. He's got a new record deal. And he meets you, and also that's where the story begins because he now gets an apartment in sort of, not uptown, but sort of near Franklin Avenue and Aldrich kind of area.
Yeah, 20-something Aldrich Avenue, you know, right around the corner from Rudolph's where he used to hang out.
Okay.
The Rib Place, open late night,
right.
Good place to hang. He lived there with his boyhood buddy, Andre Simone, who was also the bass player in his band. And Andre told me, he said, you know, it got a little too crazy there. People started coming over, looking for us. They knew we were there. We had to move somewhere else.
Because he's getting kind of famous at this point, or he's getting, or is it just locally famous maybe?
He was locally famous, you know, from being in a few high school bands that he was in, but now he got the record deal. So, you know, the buzz was building. And people knew he'd signed a record contract and all of that.
Okay.
So, you know, he became a little bit of a local celebrity because we're always hard up for local celebrities.
Right. So his first album comes out in 78, and he's ready to make a move out of this. I mean, at some point in this period, he's moving out of this Aldrich place. Where does he end up? He kind of goes to the city limits, essentially?
Well, he wanted to get away. He wanted to get into the suburbs, and he ended up moving to France Avenue, which was the borderline of Minneapolis and Edina. He technically lived on the Minneapolis side, but he was in a house there. His drummer, Bobby Z, found the house for him.
Okay.
But you know what? When you rehearse in the basement of a house on a busy street like that and you're up until all hours of the morning, neighbors don't like that.
Sure, I can imagine.
So there were a couple calls to the police, and they decided time to move.
Okay, so he moved out of the core, but not far enough at this point. So he keeps going, essentially. So this is where we kind of get into the western suburbs, right? As the Prince evolution here, as he's moving out west.
Well, yeah, he discovered he needed to purify himself in Lake Minnetonka before he shared that with anyone.
Right.
So he moved out to Orono.
Oh, okay, Orono. All right.
Okay.
And do we know how we got that spot?
One of the associates of his manager, he had a new manager, an LA-based manager. They assigned some guy to help him out in the Twin Cities, and that guy, his name was Perry Jones, found the house for him.
Okay. So he's out in Orono, and is there anything sort of, this is around 79, so there's not a lot of time has passed in sort of from his first record deal. He's kind of bopping around to these different places.
Yeah, I mean, and he's out of town a great deal. He's either recording out in the West Coast or he's touring.
Okay. And then is there anything significant about the Orono place? Because we're about to get to Chanhassen, the big topic of our conversation.
Well, it was on Lake Minnetonka.
Oh, okay. So this is where he kind of discovers Lake Minnetonka,
well,
essentially, or whatever,
I mean,
as a home.
He may have discovered it, in his youth or something.
Right, but as far as living there.
But living on Lake Minnetonka, yes.
Oh, okay.
So, and I'm sure it made an impact on him.
Yeah.
But he was kind of out already in the middle of nowhere. He liked being isolated.
Okay. So, all right. The question asker is asking, why did Prince live in Chanhassen? He becomes synonymous with this suburb, which back when he moved there wasn't really much there. And we'll talk about that a little later. So what happens now? So he does find a place in Chanhassen, right? And so how did that all transpire?
I believe it was sort of December or January of 1980 going into 81. He moved into a house on Kiowa Trail. It's like Iowa with a K in front of it.
Okay.
It's on Lake Riley. Mm-hmm. Why someone found that house for him, we don't know. I don't think he was the one out looking with the realtor, going around, looking at all kinds of houses.
But he was liking this part of town generally, seemingly.
He was liking being away from the city.
Right.
And, he needed to get away. They found him the place. It was on a lake. It was isolated. He ended up buying the lot next to him, putting a big fence around it. And not that he wanted to call attention to himself, but he painted the house purple.
Yeah, right. Is that house still around, or is that?
No, that house doesn't exist.
Okay. And you wrote in the story that this house was actually the scene of many significant recordings, right?
Right. His Controversy album was recorded there, the 1999 album, the First Time album, the Vanity 6 album, and then the posthumous album that came out, Piano and Microphone, 1983, was recorded in that house.
Okay. So, I mean, one thing about this and why we introduced you at the beginning is that I knew that if anybody could sort of get to the bottom of this question, it was Jon. And you were sort of saying, well, okay, here's the people that would have known, like the manager. You knew all the players and who was alive and who was not alive. So to answer the question, like, who are the sources that we wish were maybe still around to tell us the answers to this? But
well, Prince. But, Prince would never answer such mundane questions like, why did you choose that house? Or why Chanhassen? I mean, like when Oprah asked him why he lived in Minneapolis, he said to keep the bad people out. And, there's some truth to that statement. I mean, he doesn't mean keeping the criminals out or the ne'er-do-wells. What he meant by that, I think, to some extent, as Bobby Z explained it to me once, it's keeping the record executives out. Prince didn't like people looking over his shoulder. He didn't like people meddling with him. He wanted to create. He wanted his own freedom. And by being in isolation in Minneapolis, you didn't have these record executives coming, visiting you in the studio. Hey, what are you doing? Give us a preview. He didn't like that.
Okay.
So that was one of the advantages of being in Minneapolis. And not only was he not in Minneapolis proper, he was way out in the burbs.
Right.
But to answer the question of who probably found the house, I'm guessing the key player was Steve Farnolli.
Okay.
Steve was the manager in charge of Prince's day-to-day activities and was with him much of the time. Unfortunately, Steve passed away of cancer in 2001.
So this manager, Farnolli, is that how you pronounce his name? Okay. So he has passed away in 2001. You spoke to Morris Day, though, who had some theories about sort of how this all happened, that he ended up in Chanhassen, that Prince ended up in Chanhassen. Because
Morris, he was in the Time, so he was hanging out with Prince a lot in 1981, because the Time was essentially a creation by Prince and Morris together. Prince wrote the material, Morris sang the material. And so they were together a lot. He was out in the Chanhassen house a lot, the one on Kiowa Trail. Morris just said he liked to be far away from people. Prince just wanted to be isolated.
And so it's around this time that he's also, I mean, he's doing recordings in his home studio, but he's also doing, rehearsals and things? There's these other sort of properties that he's using for recordings, or is it just rehearsals?
It's for rehearsals and some for recording somewhat too. Recording with a bigger band. When they first started the band, they rehearsed on the West Bank, a place called Dell's Tire Mart.
It's like a tire store?
It was a tire store. It was, in a warehouse. Their equipment got stolen, so they decided we don't want to be there. They went to a place on Lake Street for a while. Then, too noisy. Then they moved to an old auto parts store in St. Louis Park. And then they keep moving further west. Then they went to the place on Flying Cloud Drive out in Eden Prairie, and another place in Eden Prairie. Because he would go on tour, and then all of a sudden that warehouse space wasn't available anymore, so they'd have to find a new space.
Oh, okay. All right.
But he had a habit of, I don't know if you want to call him interior decorator or what he was, but he had a way of transforming these rooms into a, purple magic kingdom.
Right.
He would hang these tapestries and all sorts of things in his incense. And, you'd be in a concrete warehouse and all of a sudden he would make it into this really homey, mystical space.
Well, and that's a good segue to Paisley Park in a sense. I mean, you mentioned in the story how he got inspired by going to Earth, Wind, and Fire's complex, I guess, quote unquote, complex is the name of it?
The name of it was the complex.
The complex, right, in California. And so what was that? That was like kind of a multi-purpose facility of some sort?
Right. It was a sound stage and recording studio, and they went out there to film some interior scenes. They filmed most of Purple Rain in the Twin Cities. Then they had to redo some interior scenes. And so they went to California where people were more experienced at making movies than they were in the Twin Cities here. Mm-hmm. And they went to the complex because Prince's managers, Cavallo, Ruffalo, and Farnoli, also managed Earth, Wind, and Fire at one point. So, connections, you go where you know somebody.
Right.
And I think he became enamored with the complex. And, of course, Prince, I want one of those for me.
Yeah.
And I want it yesterday.
Right. Sure. And so he's scoping out Chanhassen, and so this is where Paisley Park kind of comes into being. How did that material? He first bought a mansion somewhere?
Well, he had the Kiowa Trail place. Mm-hmm. Then he bought a mansion on the other side of Highway 5 on Galpin Boulevard, it's called. It was a house that already existed, but it was a much bigger house. So he bought that place. And then, that was about 85 that he bought that place. And then in 86, they started building Paisley Park.
Okay, so the mansion was just a stopover thing. Okay, it wasn't involved in Paisley Park or anything.
No.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, the mansion was a place he lived in until he tore it down when he got his second divorce.
Okay, which is another long story we won't get into in this conversation.
But so he was living in the mansion while they were building Paisley Park. And then his father moved into the Purple House on Kiowa Trail.
Oh, okay.
And his father lived there until his father passed away.
Right. So Paisley Park becomes not just a residence, but a destination for, describe Paisley
it wasn't
Park.
intended as a residence. It was intended as his version of the complex. Call it the Purple Playground, whatever you want to call it. It was it had 3 recording studios. There were rehearsal halls. It had a giant sound stage where they filmed commercials. Other tours came and rehearsed there. The Bee Gees came and rehearsed, and Barry Manilow and people, seemingly having no connection to Prince, would come and rehearse at Paisley Park. They filmed, TV commercials. And, there's a giant sound stage there.
Right. I was just going to note that one of our commenters on this story noted that the person said, I was in high school when Paisley opened, and on weekends we would drive out to Chanhassen to gaze at it at night. Back then it was this mysterious purple spaceship in the fields occupied by one of the world's famous people. So, I like that comment because it kind of just, the mystery of this new huge thing that's being built and kind of, is it the middle of nowhere? It's kind of a big undeveloped spot.
When it was built, it was the middle of nowhere, but it didn't look like a spaceship at all.
Okay, yeah,
it looked like
it's a metaphorical spaceship.
Yeah,
right?
It looked like a tip. Well, surprisingly, it looks very, ordinary, like a typical industrial suburban building. It's white, it's plain.
Right.
It never had a sign on it when he was there.
But he bought lots of farmland before doing this. Is that right? Like kind of undeveloped space, essentially?
I think he probably invested in some real estate out there. And he bought some other houses over the years that, some of his associates lived in.
Yeah.
But when he opened Paisley, so he built it in 86, it opened in 87, there wasn't much between where Chanhassen Dinner Theater is, because that opened in 66. And then Prince's next neighbor would have been the Landscape Arboretum, right down Highway 5.
Yeah.
There was hardly anything in Chanhassen then.
So the Chanhassen we know today, which is, it's a thriving suburb in the West Metro. Like it was still very much a small affair back then, or there wasn't much to it.
Yeah, it wasn't until the 90s that they got a Target and later Cub and Lund's and things that we identify with, Panera. Every suburb's got to have one of those. You could go see him at the Caribou. He'd go pick up Caribou. They would make late night runs to Lund's back then, 24-hour store. He often rented the Chanhassen movie theaters late at night for private screenings. He would just buy out the whole theater and he would take a bunch of people over there.
Okay.
He had bicycles. He would ride around the neighborhood, and he was supportive of the neighbors. He donated anonymously, money to the child care place down the block and in other businesses in the area.
Yeah. I always tell people to go read the comments on some of these stories because people leave such interesting anecdotes. One person said, been in Chanhassen for 30 years, saw him in the Chanhassen Cub Foods once at 3 a.m. According to the cashier, she said he was always a late night shopper. Another person said, I live on the border of Eden Prairie and Chanhassen. I remember seeing him riding his bike around town. He was always friendly to locals and fans. He's a huge part of Minnesota history. And then another person said, I remember seeing him, Rosie Gaines, and another person eating at Subway in Eden Prairie in the early 90s. Such a great memory. So I don't know, just these are fairly, mundane observations, but just to see this famous person just kind of hanging around your neighborhood must have been quite a sight.
And, people liked him being there. They were proud of it, but they didn't hassle him. Mm-hmm. It would be a thrill if he pulled up in one of his many cars next to you. Yeah. And you might wave to him and he might acknowledge you, and that was it. Right. People weren't going up and ask to take a picture or a selfie or, get an autograph.
Right. Is Prince someone who left behind a lot of mysteries like this, or is this sort of like, I know so much has been written about this person that I expected this answer was going to be like really straightforward, and it wasn't. It was kind of like there were people that had some ideas and what have you, but I don't know, is that kind of the nature of Prince, that there was a lot of mysterious things like that, or is this unusual?
That was the nature of Prince. Some of it was sort of self-styled mystery. He liked to be mysterious. He made up false information, misinformation, as we now call it, in his bio when he first started out. Okay. And that's just the way he wanted to be. You got to realize Prince existed before the internet, before 24/7 news about everything that everyone does. Mm-hmm. He didn't want people in his face. He didn't want people in his business. He liked mystery.
And the answer to this question is essentially Prince liked isolation. And then he ended up having a lot of big dreams as to like what he wanted to do with the physical space of that isolation. And so a place in the West Metro offered him a lot of opportunities to do that.
And he liked Minneapolis. So what he ended up with was isolation in Minneapolis.
Yeah. And so today, just to sort of put a closing on this, so Paisley Park is a museum, right? It's still going after his death. And so, what is it like today for people who haven't been there? I haven't been there, but I've read about what's been going on out there, but it's still happening. What's out there?
Well, you have to put it on your bucket list.
Okay.
It's a museum. It's open for tours. They occasionally have concerts and other events there. There are recording studios there that you can negotiate and possibly record in those studios. Mm. And they have special events, whether it's a private rental or it's a Prince-related event. They have a celebration every year now since his passing. They do it. Now they've timed it to June, his birthday, the beginning of June, and they have panel discussions and they have concerts and show old movies of him performing and play unreleased recordings. So, they try to do semi-regular activities out there, I would say.
Yeah. Well, Jon, thank you so much. This is fascinating. What a great history. A bit of a mystery, but I think we've gotten essentially to the bottom of it as much as we're going to get to. And that's why I really appreciate you taking all the time to work on this story, because it was fascinating.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Okay, that's it for today's show. Just a reminder that you can still tell us your favorite state fair question at the poll that I will put in the show notes. Do you have a question you'd like us to answer or feedback about the show? Send us a note at curious@startribune.com. And if you're enjoying this show, please tell a friend about it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Curious Minnesota. We want to hear from you. Ask questions and read more stories online at startribune.com/curious. Our show is recorded at the Star Tribune's headquarters in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and our music is produced by Matt Gilmer. If you like the show, please rate us on iTunes or leave a review. And until next time, stay curious.